Welcome to this evidence briefing from Lincolnshire Research School, which focuses on writing across the key stages. I'm James Siddle. I'm the director of Lincolnshire Research School. Okay, so first of all, obviously we represent the EEF, and the EEF have three kind of focuses for their work, which is the synthesis of evidence, for example, through toolkits, the mobilization, for example, through evidence guidance reports, but also the generation of evidence as well. And we'll draw upon all of these as we discuss writing. And obviously, the focus for the EEF is to break that link between family income and educational achievement. So during the course of this, very much will be focused on disadvantaged and addressing disadvantaged. And the focus of that is this data increase in the gap since COVID. This is from EPI from 2023, and it's still entrenched within England and has grown in recent times. And there is some evidence to say that that gap was actually widening pre-COVID as well. But you can see there that the gap on entry is on average 4.6 months. That increases by the end of Key Stage 2 to 10.3, and then nearly doubles again by the end of Key Stage 4 when we compare disadvantaged children to non-disadvantaged. And so one of the ways of addressing that is best bets. Best bets is by using evidence, by using research to inform our practice, but that has to marry with professional expertise to contextualize that evidence to produce evidence-informed practice. As we go along, please feel free to stop this, scan the QR code, and let us know the name of your school and where you are, and contact Karen if you'd like any resources linked to this presentation in this evidence briefing. We'll draw upon various EF guidance from the left to right, preparing for literacy in Key Stage 1 and Key Stage 2, and then literacy in secondary school. But we'll also draw upon other sources of evidence as we move through. So as we go through, we'll look at various recommendations and we'll explore the meaning of those recommendations. So writing, simple view of writing, sometimes called the not so simple view of writing. People may be familiar with the simple view of reading and perhaps less familiar with a simple view of writing. But in a way, this structures this evidence briefing around the different aspects. So you've got the top there, you've got the idea of text generation. This is around ideas, words, sentence construction. Bottom right, you've got the executive function, which is around attention, planning, reviewing, monitoring, evaluating, strategies involved. The transcriptions, the really important transcription elements of spelling, typing, and handwriting. And central to all this is working memory, and how these different elements place cognitive strains upon children when doing such a complex thing as writing. So the simple view of writing is really useful. It's really useful to thinking, well, even as a diagnostic tool, where are the elements? So for example, if a student is struggling with handwriting or it's spelling, that perhaps, and because of that, they're not able to devote as much to the strategies in executive function, for example, it might be that we have to address those to improve the outcomes in other areas. So it's really an interesting model, theoretical model, but has practical application. So effective writing is underpinned by children's expressive language capabilities, and that's made up of the things that you see there, linked sometimes to motivation to write. So, for example, having an environment, especially for the young ones, but even moving through the key stages as well, that nurtures and is supportive. That is an environment that is supportive of experimentation, of error making, for example, and making sure that children feel comfortable and motivated to express themselves. Purpose and audience are really essential and can easily be skipped past, and making sure that there's a reason to understand why we want to produce a piece of writing or a particular text type, for example, who we're writing for, who the readers are. When we write, we're expecting it to be read, for example. Who are those people? Shared book reading, sharing that vocabulary, but also that links into that high quality interactions of that toing and throwing, for example, in the early years, that qualification of language, that discussion of meaning as you go through. So all those elements fit in to motivation to write. Extensive practice is needed to develop effective handwriting, so developing children's motivation to communicate through writing is likely to be important. So effective practice, but also practice whereby the classroom teacher, teaching assistants are very much intervening if there is initial errors, for example, in handwriting or struggles with handwriting, and because it's difficult, and this is what the evidence says about it. Writing is physically and intellectually demanding. It's one of the most intellectually demanding things that we teach at school. Expressive language underpins it. They need a wide range of opportunities to commute through writing and develop children's motivation to write. Support children develop the foundations of fast, accurate, and efficient handwriting style. Monitor the product and process, and make sure that additional support is necessary if children are struggling with this particular area. And there are some really useful documents. For example, Highland Education have produced a diagnostic assessment about the stages of writing. We recently published a blog by Joe Glue, which on Lincolnshire Research from Lincolnshire Research School, which is a really interesting one about using that as a diagnostic tool and how to support support students through the different stages of developmental handwriting. So it involves motor and visual motor skills, and there's an interesting bit here. Up to 30% of children may experience handwriting difficulties. It's important to carefully monitor and plan appropriate support and intervention. So, the frequency with which, especially if, for example, you don't have those formative experiences of access to pens, for example, access to pencils, drawing, those things that you might do to build up those right skills for being able to handwrite. So being able to address that is important. And I've mentioned some of the blogs already. I've mentioned the Highland Diagnostic Tool. Handwriting Association is always a good go-to for this around the different elements of this. For example, their recommendations around posture, pencil, paper, and pressure as you go through. So again, a nice reference. Spelling and decoding should be taught alongside each other. So, for example, if you look in that second paragraph there, it's saying decoding or reading involves recognition memory with a prompt. And this is the visual going along with the verbal and the discussion of it. So the letters remain visible while they're being decoded, and making sure that the children are able to see it as they go through. So they start associating the letters with the sounds that they're being taught to make. And then as you go through, common types of spelling error, and using this as a diagnostic tool. For example, if you've got a certain percentage of children who persistently have struggled with spelling, breaking those down into phonological errors, those that are plausible, orthographical areas, those are plausible but inaccurate, and morphological errors, and actually being able to group those and fine-tune practice and fine-tune instruction to be able to support students using those broad terms is a really useful diagnostic approach. And then the EF, of course, talk about what can actually then take place in terms of the different strategies to be able to address those issues. Okay, moving through into Key Stage 2. What do good writers do? How do they approach a task? What skills, knowledge, and understanding they possess? I often think if you think about your best writers, think about the things that they do. What is it that we can bridge the gap? How can we do? What is it we can do to support those students that don't have those effective strategies? And it might be something as simple as rereading their work, for example, using a writing frame, fading that writing frame away. So, what's going well in your school, but what are also the challenges especially for specific groups like disadvantaged children. This is from Closing the Writing Gap from the colleague of ours at the Research School Network, Alex Quigley, which talks about approaches to improving should we prioritise. For example, we talked about handwriting fluency there, spelling accuracy, but all the other aspects as well. Just to draw attention to the one in the bottom right there, sustained professional development on teaching writing. In meta-analysis of writing studies, this comes out again and again. Those that have the greatest efficacy, the greatest impact on student outcomes, have a sustained professional development model. It's no good doing a train and pray model where we just do a particular writing session and hope that our teachers absorb that. We must support those, whatever that model is, whether it's lesson study, instructional coaching, for example, but just ongoing professional support to make sure that those changes are sustained, embedded over time, and are high quality in terms of that professional development, so that children have an equity of outcomes as they move through their educational experience. This is Sedita's writing rope. Again, people are probably familiar with the reading rope, Scarborough's reading rope, but this is quite a useful one for kind of breaking down those different elements of skilled writing, from critical thinking, syntax, text structure, writing craft, and transcription at the bottom there. And again, it's a worthwhile tool to think about it as in terms of diagnosis. Where are elements of problems? If we're going to have to put intervention or extra support, or direct our teaching in a certain way, what are the things that we need to focus on, for example? So it might be that there's a particular issue around writing craft, around word choice, about developing vocabulary, sentence structure, etc. And that's where we really need to focus our instruction. So again, a really useful theoretical model, but useful in terms of practical application. Content. Makes absolute sense, doesn't it? Having students write about content they're learning about, they write more. And so being able to teach content effectively, and that being linked into a knowledge building curricula, to ensure that actually we're giving them the best possibility of expressing themselves in an effective way. So I've mentioned already back at purpose audience, it came up earlier on, but it's worth considering the issues around purpose and audience, and making sure that that's really interwoven into the process. And as it says in there, there are four main purposes of writing: to describe, to narrate, to inform, and to persuade. And it's important that pupils learn to modify their writing according to their audience. So often we plan thinking about text structure, vocabulary, for example, but we don't necessarily always think about the purpose of an audience. So for example, if you were doing an information text, it was an information text on an aspect of wildlife, for example, who might use it? How might they use it? If we didn't have this information text, how would that disadvantage those people that might otherwise have used it, both in terms of lay people, but also in terms of professional people, if they were using it for a survey, for example. So constantly weaving that through the writing process. Okay, composition strategies. Yeah, we do, but through doing that, it's really important to look at the top: process before product. Really focusing on that executive function in that bottom right-hand corner: the attention, the planning, the reviewing, the evaluating, the editing, all those things that form a strategy, so that we can support often the most disadvantaged learners in that process of being able to write. And just an outline here from the EF about strategies. So there are various ways of approaching this, but the writing process involves that planning element, that generation of ideas, that goal setting, who's setting the goals, for example, gathering information, gathering content, for example, drafting, writing down key ideas linked to often to high quality text, and there's that link between reading and writing, revising, making changes in the light of feedback and self-evaluation. That's both teacher feedback, but that's also peer feedback as well. Remember that sort of social constructivist kind of model of we write well often where we write together within a writing community. Editing, making changes to ensure writing is accurate and coherent, checking elements like spelling and grammar, but also that purpose and audience as well. Are we achieving our intentions? And then it's presenting work for the target audience to read. So that very distinct process as we go through. And that links then to metacognition. If we think to the EEF toolkit, metacognition, self-regulation are right at the top there in terms of effective strategies. And there's that really kind of nice model on the left-hand side here. It's the knowledge of task. So what is it that I've got to write? Is it a report at the moment? What are the features of that report, for example? What are the strategies that I've got to do to be able to write that report. For example, I've got to be able to look at models. I've got to be able to deconstruct those models into the success criteria. I've got to use a writing frame. Hopefully the teacher will then pare back that writing frame, pull it back so that actually the pupils become more independent in that. And then there's the knowledge of self, that it's a difficult thing to do. I've achieved it before, for example, what the tools, what the strategies that I've used to be able to make an effective piece of writing. And then there's that regulation, the planning, the monitoring and evaluation, which feed into that process to ensure that we have an effective outcome. And again, that links into the writing process. Notice purpose and audience inside that model on the left-hand side there. Sit on the outside could easily be missed, but are absolutely essential as we go through. So what about it that makes so hard? We've already talked about the cognitive demands, and I think a model like this is really interesting, especially on the right-hand side there. We think about the idea of a gradual release, the idea of I demonstrate, I do that modeled writing, we do shared writing, guided writing, which moves on to that later stage, the you do together or you do alone. And sometimes that just might be writing a word, it might be writing a single sentence, for example, but then it's moving it on to that independent practice through that gradual release model. And that fits into the EF's 7-step model there, from activating prior knowledge, strategy instruction, the process. We're going, as much as teaching content, as much as teaching genre specific elements, we're also going to be teaching a strategy as we're going through. And that strategy process must be explicit. Model the strategy, memorization of the strategy. Memorization might be, for example, use of mnemonics. So a mnemonic, for example, linked into peer feedback might be IE. I identify what has been done well. E, explain why it's been done well. Identify what has been done less well. E, explain why it has been done less well. So just structuring strategy around, for example, mnemonics, guide that practice leading to independent practice, and then structure that reflection at the end there. What is it that's made the difference? Not only in terms of our knowledge of text type, but in terms of knowledge of strategy. And there's no quick way to develop these essential skills. Practice should be extensive and supported by effective feedback as well. The role of the teacher partly is around, sentence construction. It's around the features of a text, but it's also around strategy instruction as well. How to focus your effort appropriately there is probably the key to this. I mentioned sentence construction a few times here, and there's quite a lot of evidence around focusing on sentence construction and the efficacy of sentence construction, not moving too quickly on to more extensive writing, for example, whole paragraphs, etc., but focusing on individual sentences and the components of a sentence and being able to manipulate those. And there's some really nice quotes there from Alex. Too often in the classroom, sentences are modelled, but people don't have a strong enough concept of the different sentence moves, functions, how to manipulate them. Instead of tackling lots of different genres and undertaking error-strewn big writes, we should be explicit in deliberately practicing crafting great sentences. And in doing that, overlearn those. So honing the 4 sentence variation strategies, pupils have the tools to master writing in any subject. And the 4 that Alex is talking about are sentence combining, which is probably one of the most common elements that we do there, which is combining in the top left-hand corner there is 2 or more sentences into a more complex sentence. And we can structure that in many different ways. Then there's sentence expanding, there where we take a very simple sentence, he's a total monster, and we add the different elements into it. He's a total monster, adding an extra clause, stomping through the school, screaming at petrified pupils. Sometimes, of course, we want sentence shrinking. We want to pull that back in a variety of different ways. In narrative writing, actually, we want a really short sentence, for example. Sometimes there's the problem of purple prose, where children are using too many adjectives in there, too many adverbs, and the writing is too flowery. Actually, you've lost control of that writing. Sometimes you want them to be more succinct. There's a nice example there from geography of how we can use vocabulary, for example, more refined vocabulary, knowledge of language, to actually shrink that sentence to be more concise. And then there's a structural element through sentence signposting, where we use conjunctions to clarify and connect across and within sentences. And there's example there, first, in addition to, conclude, for example. So rigidly practicing these, it might be, for example, the beginning of a writing lesson, you might just spend 5 or 10 minutes practicing some of these linked to the text, the genre that you're actually studying, so that that actually builds up that overall knowledge of text. Yeah. Sorry, wrong direction on the slides there. Okay, in terms of secondary schools, a lot of the elements there are continuing. So you, very much, if you break down complex tasks, you can still see there writing's challenging, explicit instruction is essential. Breaking it down into planning, monitoring, and evaluating, that same cycle that we were seeing in key stage 2. So, for example, word level, sentence level, whole text level instruction, just as we saw previously, ensure students understand the vocabulary, and that's teaching that tier 2 vocabulary. And it's considering how we do that. How do we teach tier 2 vocabulary? Often people discuss it within the context of reading, and reading into writing is an essential process and understanding that, but how we capture those. For example, what tools can we use? What graphic organizers, for example, might support that? So, for example, using a Freya model, where you have a word in the middle and you um, around the outside, the different quadrants, where you might consider the definitional meaning, you might consider the word within a context, you might consider some non-examples. So building up that vocabulary and making sure the vocabulary instruction is an essential part of it. And then moving on again to the strategies, using graphic organizers for strategies. So for example, you might use a planning frame. I've mentioned already about fading that planning frame away. So it might be that there's a mnemonic link to the planning frame, and then that mnemonic strips back, so you end up eventually with a blank piece of paper. So, and in terms of an adaptive teaching model, you might have students that are on different trajectory in terms of that fading of the structure. Some children will understand it very early on, be able to recall the different elements of a structure, your introduction, for example, the points of elaboration, your ending, the language and links that are in there. Others might need a model which is more complete to be able to use that as a structure as they move through, and then just fading certain elements of it. But eventually we should aim for that, them to have an opportunity to be able to produce that planning structure by themselves, so they're ready and independent for the next stage in their education. So effective ways of combining reading and writing that I've mentioned already. For example, writing before reading is an interesting one. For example, by asking students to bullet point what they currently know about a topic, or generate questions they would like to try to answer through reading. And that gives us a real kind of diagnostic start point, doesn't it? If it's something that's just completely unfamiliar, that can be done as a shared process, or it can be done as an individual process. Top right there, asking students to write short summaries of the text they read. This is a skill that some may struggle with. It's quite complex, but actually it involves thinking really hard about the main points of a text, and allows us to generate more understanding of what they do, and crucially what they don't know about a text, and whether they're picking up the main aspects of a text. And finally, just to support all this is the importance of effective implementation. I mentioned previously around ensuring, for example, that there was a sustained and embedded process of professional development linked to writing to ensure greater efficacy for pupil outcomes. So ensuring that that's part of that process that we explore, first of all, in that top right, we explore that as a community as well. What are our challenges, for example? What are the things that we actually really need to focus on? Are we certain that this is what we need to focus on, or do we bring our bias, for example, to this? Then ensuring that we're preparing properly for it. Prepare might be that we just think, well, actually, what we need to do is just trial this. We need to trial this in one class, one department, for example, as a kind of test and learn process. Then, of course, we move on to more delivery, being able to monitor that, being able to be nimble and adjust to that as we go through, so that we sustain that over a period of time, that constant ongoing sustained professional development, which links into the EF guidance report on professional development, making sure that from these broad headings of building knowledge, motivating teachers, developing teaching techniques, and embedding practice, that we make sure there is as many of those components in there to ensure that we have success through professional development. Thank you very much. From this, you can see that this is we're sort of part way through, nearly halfway through our evidence briefings. The next one, which is in March, will be improving maths. Thank you very much. And as mentioned before, if you do have any questions for this, please do get in touch with Karen, and especially if you're interested in any of the references or resources that I've referred to during the course of this evidence briefing. Thank you.